Good morrow, friends. This is Jordan, and you're listening to Not Strictly History. Hello, everybody. It's great to be with you today. Welcome to Not Strictly History, Season 2, Episode 2. Brr, 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 brr. We're all happy to be here. Hello. I had so much fun with the Woodstock episode. I hope that all of you guys liked it as well. It's been so much fun. I've actually already discussed it with a few people, and by that I mean my sister, who called me and is biologically programmed to support my decisions. However, it was still fun, and I had a great time. And I hope that all of you really enjoyed the episode and are learning a lot of things. Again, I changed the way that I do all of my research and all of my writing, so our episodes are going to feel different this season, and I'm really, really excited about it. And again, I did mention this last episode, but our episodes are going to be longer this season because I just want to do a more thorough job. I want there to be more meat and potatoes to all of our episodes and have it be less of an appetizer, if that makes any sense. I don't know why I went with a food analogy, but there you go. And as always, my dog Duncan is here with us today. He wants me to throw his toy for him. So if you hear a ruckus in the background, it's Duncan. Anyway, business is down, taken care of. Let's get on to our story today because it is a really, really fun story. A lot of twists and turns, and that's actually really fitting for the topic. So let's begin. If you have siblings, or even just close friends or family, you will probably relate to this little story that we're going to start off with. So imagine that you are a pretty creative person. You like literature and music, and you love the theater, and you have even dabbled in writing in the past. You're fascinated by thrillers and mysteries and murder, aren't we all? And then one day, your older sister says to you, I bet that there is no way you could write a good detective novel. What would you do? Thank you. I can hear all of you shouting it back at me. The obvious choice in this circumstance, really the only choice in this circumstance, is to not only write a detective novel, but to write the best detective novel that was ever written. This may sound like a hypothetical situation, of course, but it's actually a true story. Not only that, it is the origin story of one of the most well known authors of all time. Because, my friends, this is the origin story of the one and only Dame Agatha Christie. She wrote her very first novel, The Mysterious Affair at Styles, simply because her older sister Madge had bet her that she couldn't do it. Isn't that insane? She bet her that she couldn't write a good detective novel, and Agatha Christie said, Hold my beer. Actually, she didn't. Normally, I would say yes, that's what she said. But fun fact, Agatha Christie actually didn't drink. So that's not what she said. Anyway, I digress. So this little moment of her defying her sister gave birth to a career that spanned 5 decades, and perhaps Agatha Christie's most impressive title, best-selling author of all time. This is me pausing to allow that to sink in. We're going to pause again. Yes, it is not a lie. Dame Agatha Christie's works are only outsold by the Bible and the works of William Shakespeare. And since you can't really quantify the sales of those two entities, it's true. Dame Agatha Christie is the world's best-selling author. Isn't that insane? So here's the thing. I'm pretty sure that we all know who Agatha Christie is. She's a household name. And even if you don't know her, you know her because most of the things that we know and love about mysteries and thrillers originated with her work, which means that even if you don't know her name, you are very familiar with her work and its influence on the world. You are, in fact, kind of a product of it in many ways. Now, listen, I'm going to be honest. I'm fairly ashamed to say that I had not read any of Agatha Christie's works until fairly recently. However, this does not mean that she hasn't had an influence in my life, which is exactly why I wanted to do an episode about her this season. I've had quite a bit of Agatha Christie in my life, but not a lot of knowledge about her. So, learning more about her in this whole process has just been really rewarding and really exciting. Now, in high school, I did drama competitions. Crazy that I did that. Anyway, I was part of a group of kids. We all did a drama piece called, okay, wait. Listen, I'm getting ahead of myself. We went to competition, a little group of us, and the piece that we were performing was a scene out of one of Agatha Christie's plays, Witness for the Prosecution. I was the lawyer in the scene. I did a great job. And then my drama department also put on a production of 10 Little Indians, aka And Then There Were None. I was actually not in this play. I can't remember why. I think I decided not to try out. I don't remember. But all of my very best friends were in this play. And as a drama kid, I pretty much lived in the auditorium anyway. So it kind of felt like I was in the play, even though I wasn't. I've also seen Kenneth Branagh portray Hercule Poirot. Guys, I even made myself a phonetic pronunciation. Let me try again. Hercule Poirot. Thank you. Kenneth Branagh played him in Murder on the Orient Express and Death on the Nile, which you have maybe seen. And I'm throwing applause everywhere because I think that he portrays him magnificently. So overall, I feel like I've had a pretty okay exposure to Agatha Christie's works over the years, but we need to understand something right from the get-go. And it's that talking about Agatha Christie does not mean that we're just here to talk about a crime writer and call it a day. No, my friends. Agatha Christie's life was absolutely fascinating. She lived in a time of transition and change. She experienced incredible joy and immense heartbreak. She traveled the world, and she still managed to become the world's best-selling author of all time. It's magnificent. I'm really excited to just dive into her life with you and her career because there's just so much to unpack. So, without further ado, let's put on our detective caps and dive into the life of the Queen of Crime. Agatha Mary Clarissa Miller was born on September 15th, 1890, in Torquay, Devon, southwest England, into a wealthy upper middle class family. She was the youngest of three children. She was one of those children who was born much later than her older siblings, which kind of made her seen as more of an afterthought. However, she was not treated like an afterthought. Even though she was the only child at home growing up, she was very, very much loved. And, fun fact, Agatha Christie, well, at this point, Agatha Miller, was a huge dog lover. Her very first puppy was a Yorkshire Terrier. She was given this puppy for her 5th birthday. Now listen, she was so happy that she couldn't even speak, and she had to go into the bathroom to gather her thoughts. Let me break this down for you. She was 5 years old, and she was given a puppy for her birthday. And she was so out of this world excited that she had to excuse herself so that she could gather herself together. If that is not the most British thing I have ever heard, that is hysterical, actually. Just think of any 5-year-old would any, like, it's hysterical. Anyway, this Yorkshire Terrier was called Tony, even though his full name was George Washington, obviously. So Agatha's mother was British and her father was an American, and they had actually planned to move back to America after they got married. But her father, Frederick, was in New York on business when her mother, Clara, found a home named Ashfield. She fell in love with this home and bought it, and then called Frederick up and was like, hey, we're not moving to America because I just bought a house, which is the most fantastic, empowering thing I've ever heard in my life. I love that Clara did that. I just love it. So Ashfield became the family home, and it was the place where Agatha grew up. Now, her mother, Clara, was an excellent storyteller. She was known all to everybody as a great storyteller. For whatever reason, she didn't want Agatha to learn how to read until she was 8 years old. Now, there is some modern research that backs this up, that backs up the idea of children waiting to learn to read until they're a little bit older. Apparently, it helps with brain development, etc., etc. I don't know if this research existed back then. Pretty progressive of Clara, though. However, Agatha was bored and completely brilliant and awesome. So she taught herself to read by the age of 4. You heard me correctly. And her father, Frederick, helped with her homeschooling because she was homeschooled, which is very unusual for the time for her father to be involved in her education at all. When she was little, she loved all of the children's stories of the time. She enjoyed the authors Edith Nesbit and Louisa May Alcott, of course, who doesn't? And they were some of her favorites. She also loved poetry and startling thrillers from America. She invented imaginary friends, she played with animals, and she attended dance classes. As a girl, she also loved amateur plays. She was very big into the theater her entire life. And she later wrote that one of her favorite things in childhood was lavish feasts at Christmas, which is such a little kid thing, like to be so excited for all the food that you get at Christmas. Actually, it's really intriguing. The food that my family traditionally eats at Christmas time, we always have a ham. We don't do turkey at Christmas, we do ham. We wake up on Christmas morning to the smell of ham cooking. Very nostalgic and beautiful. And then on Christmas Day, my parents will make a humongous pot of chicken cheesy chowder, which is just potato soup masquerading as chicken chowder. And here's the thing, I hate this chowder, and I'm not a fan of ham either. So at the holidays, when everybody else is worried about putting on weight, I am starving the whole time. This isn't a tangent I planned on going on, but nevertheless, I always am hungry on Christmas Day. Anyway, Agatha Christie began writing poems when she was still a little girl. And again, the family home was named Ashfield. When she was 5 years old, the family rented out the home in order to save a little bit of money, I think. And they spent some time in France. Of course, when you want to save money, you rent out your house and go to France. Obviously. While they were there, Agatha learned idiomatic French, which becomes really important in her life. So, I'm not exactly sure why this occurred, but financial difficulties were falling on the family, and it became very stressful to her father over time, which you can understand because they had been well off, they had been doing well. Again, I don't know what the financial difficulties were. I researched Agatha Christie for a long time and read a lot of stuff to make this episode. And again, I'm not sure what the financial difficulties were. However, they existed, and it was really hard on her dad. And he actually suffered a series of heart attacks, and then he passed away when Agatha was only 11, which is incredibly, incredibly tragic. So, Frederick did have heart problems, but he officially passed away of pneumonia and chronic kidney disease. Agatha later said that the death of her father was really the end of her childhood, which you can see that being a thing, especially when she's the only child at home. So after this, Agatha became her mother's closest companion. I mean, Clara was completely distraught over the death of her husband, and they just, they only had each other at this point. After Frederick's death, they came upon more money setbacks, and there was actually a lot of talk of selling Ashfield, wondering what they should do. Somehow they were able to make a way forward, and they did not have to sell Ashfield, which is a brilliant little piece of hope in the beginning of this story. So, when Agatha Christie was 15 years old, Clara sent her away to Paris to finish out her education, and she was to focus on music while she was there. At this time, Agatha lived in various boarding houses as she took piano and singing lessons. Now, listen, this is a really, really cool fact. She was actually talented enough at the piano that many were encouraging her to go into it as a profession. She was good enough to be a professional player, but she was also incredibly shy in front of people that she didn't know. So she ended up not pursuing that career. Now, listen, there's actually a little bit of disparity in the sources that I found. Some sources said or implied that Agatha didn't go for a piano career because she just kind of gave up on the dream and moved on. But listen, her website said that it was because of how shy she was. And her website is not a joke, people, okay? The people who run that website are Agatha Christie scholars, and they know what they're talking about. So I'm going to believe them. It was because she was shy. Now, listen, the other reason that I'm going to believe that is because throughout this episode, you will learn that Agatha Christie was not the kind of person to let something drop if she was passionate about it. And as you'll find out, she was very passionate about music and continued to be passionate about music for her whole life. So, even though she didn't go down this particular avenue, she always stayed passionate about music, which is very telling. By the age of 18, Agatha had begun writing short stories, and in one source that I found, it said that she started doing this to, quote, amuse herself. Now listen, this is the story. When she wrote her very first short story, again, she was 18, this story was called The House of Beauty. And she wrote it because she had been very, very ill with influenza, and she was in bed still recovering, and she couldn't get out of bed, and she was very, very bored. So she wrote a story. So, yes, that's correct. She wrote her very first story because she was bored, in bed, had been sick, couldn't get up, and so she just wrote a story, which I love. And again, it was called The House of Beauty, and it is actually an early version of her later story, House of Dreams. Now, a really important little tidbit about this time in her life, as she started writing more and more and developed more into short stories, they had a family friend named Eden Philpotts, who was actually a pretty well-known author at the time, and he would read Agatha's stories and he would give her criticism and advice, and I think that he really, really helped her on the more technical side of writing. I think that it was a way for her to, what am I trying to say? I just think it was really important to have him there, I think, because as passionate and creative and artistic as Agatha is, you'll see there's also a very strategic, scientific way to her mind. And so I think having this creative outlet, but having a more strategic way to approach it, was really, really positive for her in a lot of ways. So that's how she first got into writing. Now, at this time, so Agatha again, she's 18, her mother Clara's health and again the need to save some money basically dictated their next move in life. What were they going to do next? Well, I'll tell you, friends, I'll tell you what they did next. In the year 1910, Agatha Christie and her mother Clara went to Cairo, Egypt for a 3-month quote unquote season at the Gezira Palace Hotel. I'm screaming. Can you hear me? Losing my mind. I'm actually screaming. Listen, this is the time in our world's history when British people would just freaking go to Egypt for fun, for vacations, for months on end. And it is the stuff of dreams, my friends, okay? Think linen suits. Think drinks on a boat. Think traipsing around the pyramids because that's a thing they could do. I mean, just think about it, okay? And that's what was happening. Listen, Downton Abbey aspires to the gloriousness that this little era was. I said what I said. Now, listen. At this time, evening dresses and parties seemed to interest Agatha a lot more than the local archaeological sites, which, if you know anything about Agatha's later life or just anything about her in general, that's actually really odd and kind of hysterical. However, again, she was young, so maybe she was just vibing. I mean, I mentioned disparities earlier. There are quite a few disparities in many sources that you find about Agatha Christie. Did she love these parties? Well, it mentions that she did, but later in life she said that she hated parties. So maybe it's just a change over time. Maybe when she was young, they're in Cairo, it's exciting. Who doesn't love a good party, I guess? Me. I'm not into parties, but this episode isn't about me. So the friends that she made in Cairo and the young couples that she met there, they invited her to a bunch of house parties at home in England once they all got back. And listen, there were several marriage proposals that resulted from all of this mingling. And Agatha actually had relationships with 4 different men, and she was even briefly engaged to one of them. But then she was like, nah, I don't want to marry you. So they broke it off. Personally, it seems to me that at this time, Agatha was just living some kind of dreamy 1910s life. And it is so spectacular to think about that I can barely wrap my brain around it. So maybe she was just enjoying being a little bit older and getting to travel and having friends. And you know what? There's nothing wrong with that. However, life was about to change for Agatha. In 1912, at a big house party not far from her home village, Agatha was introduced to a young man by the name of Archibald Christie, known as Archie. He was a qualified aviator who had applied to join the Royal Flying Corps. She was 21 or 22 at the time that they met. And listen, it was a whirlwind romance. She later wrote in her autobiography that it was the quote, excitement of the stranger that attracted them to each other. They were engaged after 3 months. Now, they really wanted to get married as soon as possible, but neither of them had the money for it, so they couldn't get married right away. They weren't married until 2 years later, on Christmas Eve of 1914, which is so romantic, a Christmas Eve wedding. My mother would kill me if I got married on Christmas Eve because that's actually a really busy day. However, this was a different time. Now, listen, I want you to picture this in your head because it's so beautiful. She and Archie were married on Christmas Eve, 1914, in England. Stop and think for just a minute. 1914, England. What's going on? That's right. World War I. And both of them had already had experience with the war. Archie was fighting in France at this time, and Agatha was working on the home front. She was a volunteer in the Voluntary Aid Detachment and a Red Cross hospital. So they spent their honeymoon night in the Grand Hotel in Torquay. And then on December 27th, 3 days later, Archie had to go back to France. So they're married probably in a small, just little, what word am I looking for? You're probably all shouting it at me right now. Just a small, quaint little ceremony. They have their honeymoon, which is 3 days long, but it's over Christmas. And then Archie goes back to fight in the war. I mean, it's like movie stuff. It's crazy. So over the war years, they weren't able to meet very frequently, obviously. He was at war, she was at home helping with the war. It wasn't until January of 1918 that Archie was posted to the War Office in London, and Agatha later said that she felt like this was when her married life truly began, which makes a lot of sense. Okay, my friends, we are not done talking about World War One because the war years, well, I mean, the war was kind of important. However, the war years were incredibly important in Agatha's life. So we need to talk a little bit more about them. It was during this time that Agatha started writing detective stories. And again, she started writing because her older sister Madge basically bet her that she couldn't do it. So obviously, you have to prove your sibling wrong. But she also began writing for a different reason. Now, if you'll remember, she was working at a Red Cross hospital in her hometown of Torquay. And it's really incredible. The story, like the part of the story that we're about to talk about, is something I did not know about Agatha Christie and is absolutely crucial to who she is as a person. So, the hospital that she was working at, they opened a dispensary, a pharmacy, and they offered her a job there. So, she accepted the job and eventually she completed the examination of the Society of Apothecaries on April 13th, 1917, to become a dispenser, a pharmacist. How freaking awesome is that? It's it's so cool. Again, something I didn't know about her, but it's also just crucial to who she was because she always kept up her pharmaceutical knowledge, always stayed current with it. And it's something that she went back to over the years for both writing novels and plays, and she also used it for public service. Super cool. So, okay, here's an interesting story. So, before she became a full blown pharmacist and was just working in the dispensary, the pharmacist that she was working with had made up a medicine with the wrong dose of something that could have been very, very harmful. And rather than correct him because he was kind of a douche, Agatha decided to break the capsules so that they would have to redo the medicine. Now, listen, again, this pharmacist wasn't the funnest guy to be around. He was constantly bragging that he kept Curare in his pocket. And what is that, you ask? I'll tell you. It's a paralyzing agent. Yeah, it was often used in early anesthesia for yeah. So, he just keeps them in his pocket. Don't we all? I do. Anyway, he actually later inspired one of her characters, which I love. And let me tell you, friends, that's one of the best things about being a writer is that you can passive aggressively get revenge on all of the stupid people that you encounter. I said what I said. So anyway, she's experiencing all of this stuff at work in the middle of a war. It really does make sense that she would need some kind of escape for her brain to do something else, really. So her debut novel was The Mysterious Affair at Styles. The first thing she did was work out the plot. And then she quote unquote found her characters while riding a tram in Torquay. Now listen, this is a thing to be going about your life and to see someone or something just out in the world and to think that's part of my story. I've done that many times, and it's actually a really exciting thing. So she ended up spending a 2 week holiday at the Moreland Hotel, and this is where slash when she finished the manuscript for The Mysterious Affair at Styles. Now, this is so cool, okay? Because she used her medicinal expertise in this story because the killer uses poison. And it was so well described in her book that after it was published, her book was given a review in a pharmaceutical journal. Isn't that insane? It was completely unprecedented for a fiction writer. Again, her book was given a review in a pharmaceutical journal. So cool. Absolutely mind blowing. I love it. So let's jump ahead to the year 1919, because this year was a very momentous year for our girl Agatha. It was the end of the war. Archie had found a job in London, and they had just enough money to rent and furnish a flat, which we love for them. On August 5th, 1919, Agatha gave birth to the couple's only daughter, Rosalind. Now listen, we're coming to a really, there's just so much here. Let's just get into it. So Agatha had been trying really hard to get The Mysterious Affair at Styles published. She had gone to publisher after publisher. And finally, she found a publishing company named The Bodley Head, and the publisher there, John Lane, accepted the manuscript for The Mysterious Affair at Styles. And he also, at the same time, contracted Agatha for 5 more books, which she later said that she felt that this was exploitative. I could see how she would feel that way. But listen, there's more. He insisted on some changes to her manuscript. That was part of the conditions, including reworking the entire final chapter, which I don't know how I feel about. Originally, the final chapter was going to be in the courtroom, and it was going to be this huge, wonderful, reveal in the courtroom. But John Lane proposed the now familiar denouement in the library drawing room. You know, in every detective story in the world, how at the very end, they're in the drawing room and the detective tells you how it happened? This is where that came from. So, some little bit facts. Okay, Jordan, English is hard. About this first book, The Mysterious Affair at Styles. It took 4 years to write, and she went through 6 publishers before she got it published. And listen to this. She had to spell the word cocoa as COCO because the publishers insisted that she do this. Now listen, Agatha Christie was known by family and friends to never be a great speller. However, in her manuscript, she'd spelled cocoa the correct way, COCOA, but again, her publishers insisted on spelling it COCO. And after it was published, people were constantly pointing this out to her and saying that she was never a good speller, so obviously this happened, which is incredibly upsetting because this was not her being a bad speller, this was her publisher being a weirdo. Fun fact. Anyway, this book earned her £25, adjusted for inflation. That too. Why don't we just call it that? That's £1,000, which is today about $1,300. So, not bad, Agatha. So, I don't know if you know this or know much about this first book that Agatha wrote. However, Agatha's very first book introduced arguably her most famous character, Hercule Poirot. And he's so important that we're going to take a minute to talk about him because he became an entity unto himself. So actually, as Agatha is writing this book, she's noticing that again, it's World War One, and there are many Belgian refugees that are coming into the English countryside at this time, including her hometown of Torquay. Now, Hercule Poirot is not based on any particular person. However, Agatha was really intrigued by the idea of a Belgian refugee, and maybe this refugee was a former police officer. And then she realized he would be an excellent detective for her book, The Mysterious Affair at Styles. And thus, Hercule is born. So, again, we're going to take just a teeny break from Agatha's timeline here because we need to talk about Hercule because he is chef's kiss amazing. And there's just a lot of beautiful things about him, to be honest. So, yes, we're going to spend time talking about a fictional character now. Listen. Hercule Poirot is a world-renowned, mustachioed Belgian private detective. He is unsurpassed in intelligence and his understanding of the criminal mind. He is respected by police forces and heads of state across the globe, as is only good and proper. He features in 33 original novels and over 50 short stories. He does a lot, guys. Now, listen, the description of Hercule is my favorite. He has an egg-shaped head that's often tilted to one side. He has green eyes that shine when he gets excited. He dresses very precisely. He has the utmost pride in his appearance. Even more famous than the man himself is actually his mustache. It's luxurious, magnificent, immense, dedicatedly groomed. It precedes him into the room. It's a unique talking point, and it's very provocative. Again, it might be more famous than Hercule himself. His mustache kind of became a character all on its own. And Hercule has a friend by the name of Hastings, and he explains Hercule and his character thoroughly in The Mysterious Affair at Styles. He says that, quote, as a detective, Poirot's flair had been extraordinary. Love that. So, while some detectives would scramble around the floor looking for clues, Poirot used psychology and his extensive knowledge of human nature to weed out the criminals. And Hastings always also said that Poirot will take physical evidence into account, but more often than not, his combination of order, method, and his little gray cells does the trick. Listen, the quote, little gray cells, this is something Hercule Poirot talks about all the time. And you might be thinking, what is that? But your first thought is actually correct. When he says little gray cells, he's literally talking about his brain cells. Gray matter, you know. Don't we all refer to our brain cells that way? So Poirot's cases are invariably finished with typical dramatic denouement, satisfying his own ego, because he's got an ego, and confirming to all that he is truly the greatest mind in Europe, because he is. Now listen, we're just going to go on some facts about Hercule Poirot, because we love him. So in the first book, it was originally explained that we talked about this. Sorry, I got distracted by something. So originally, he explained everything about the crime and how it happened in a courtroom. But again, because of the publisher and everything, it was changed to a drawing room discussion. Personally, I really would have loved the courtroom, but that's okay. Hastings said, quote, he was hardly more than 5 feet 4 inches, but carried himself with great dignity. His head was exactly the shape of an egg, and he always perched it a little to one side. The neatness of his attire was almost incredible. I believe a speck of dust would have caused him more pain than a bullet wound. I love that sentence. I don't know why. I just find it incredibly endearing. And actually, interestingly enough, Agatha Christie initially considered different detectives for this story, either a schoolboy or a scientist, which is very, very intriguing. So there's actually a short story, well, one of the short stories that Hercule is in called The Chocolate Box. It was first published in the Sketch magazine, and it mentions his little sister Yvonne. So we know he has a sister, and he is very unhappy with disorder. He finds it, quote, really insupportable that every hen lays an egg of a different size. What symmetry can there be on the breakfast table? He is also known to have refused to eat an irregularly shaped loaf of bread. I'm pausing because I love it and I also feel bad for him. How does he survive in the world? I don't know. He takes great pride in his appearance, from his immaculately groomed mustache to his patent leather shoes. And he uses a special preparation called Revive It to conceal his gray hair. His mustache was so important to the character and so important to Agatha Christie that she actually had to approve its appearance in 1965 when he was portrayed in a mystery film. That's how important the mustache is, people. I'm not making this up. And here's a beautiful, beautiful little fun fact. Poirot's obituary appeared on the front page of the New York Times in 1975, in advance of the publication of a story called Curtain, Poirot's Last Case. This was the very first time that a fictional character received this treatment. And I love it that it was Hercule Poirot. Agatha Christie said that for Poirot, the story Cards on the Table was the murder that really won his technical approval. And it's because it was so insane. In this story, there's a very, very flamboyant party, and the host is murdered in front of everyone. And of course, it just takes a lot of mind to solve this case. So it makes sense that that would kind of be his favorite case, for lack of a better term. More facts about Hercule. He is very, very particular about what he drinks. He regularly consumes hot chocolate and herbal tea, and he once called decaffeinated coffee an abomination. But listen, he's very into the continental European tradition of exotic coffee, where you can just go to Europe and they hand you cups of coffee that are like made with gold or something. I've never done that, but there's something about continental European coffee. I know this. I don't know how I know this. I just know this. Now listen, again, we have Hercule in 33 novels, over 50 short stories. I think it was about 59 actually, and one original full-length play, all by Agatha Christie. And interesting fact, there are 4 continuation novels by author Sophie Hannah, which we love. Twice in her life, Agatha Christie actually saw Hercule Poirot, or a man that she thought, oh my gosh, that's my character. She saw him once while she was lunching in Savoy and on a boat in the Canary Islands, which both of those experiences must have just been really rewarding. She often discouraged publishers from having representations of Hercule Poirot on book jackets. There are some exceptions. Poirot Investigates has a picture of him on the front, but it's because he was so particular about his appearance as a character. I feel like Agatha was the same when it came to him, and she just had this vision of how he was and who he was in her head. And so it makes sense that she wouldn't be super into people having a lot to look at. I think she just wanted you to see him in your head rather than be influenced by images. And I respect that. And again, when he died, fictionally, Hercule Poirot was given a full-page obituary on the front page of the New York Times. Some quotes from Hercule. This one is from The Mystery of the Blue Train. My name is Hercule Poirot, and I am probably the greatest detective in the world. I want that tattooed somewhere. This one is from Five Little Pigs. I do not need to bend and measure the footprints and pick up the cigarette ends and examine the bent blades of grass. It is enough for me to sit back in my chair and think. This next one is from the story The Murder on the Links, and he says this to his friend Hastings. Pardon, but your tie is not symmetrical. Permit that I rearrange him. I love this quote so much. And this one is from Double Sin. It is an art, he murmured, the growing of a mustache. I have sympathy for all who attempt it. Which is beautiful because clearly he has this superior mustache. I could talk about Hercule Poirot for many more moons, but that's a really good overview of who he is as a character and what he meant to Agatha Christie and to the world too. Okay, now that we have given Hercule Poirot just a fraction of the adoration that he deserves, we're going to very briefly return to the timeline of Agatha Christie's life. We are now just after World War I, and she and Archie are living in London. Agatha continued to write after the war. If you will remember, She was contracted for 5 more books after the mysterious affair at Styles. At this time, she began experimenting with different types of thriller and murder mystery stories. She created a detective couple named Tommy and Tuppence, and then she created a character named Miss Marple. And we need to talk about Miss Marple. Miss Marple is, obviously, another detective character created by Agatha Christie. And my friends, she is a really big deal. She is right up there with Hercule Poirot. Agatha Christie is the only crime writer ever to have created 2 equally famous and much loved characters, Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple. So clearly, we need to take another short pause from Agatha herself in order to spend some time talking about the lovely Miss Marple, because she's an absolute icon, let me tell you. So, Miss Jane Marple is from the small village of St. Mary Mead. She has every opportunity to observe human nature. She says, quote, "There is a great deal of wickedness in village life," which I'm totally here for. She has this ability to blend into the background because she's an older woman that nobody pays attention to. She has a very, very shrewd intelligence that is hidden behind a love of knitting, gardening, and gossip. Again, she's very unassuming and often overlooked. However, this is what makes her a good detective. This is what gives her the freedom to pursue the truth. Haha. Now listen. The criminals and murderers are always failing to realize that with every little knitting stitch or little gardening or, with every little thing she's doing, she's actually solving the crime. Nobody suspects her of being this criminal catcher, and it's incredible. Okay, this is actually really, really fun. One of the characters in a Miss Marple story, Sir Henry Clithering, this is the story called The Body in the Library. He says of Miss Marple that she is, quote, "the finest detective God ever made. Natural genius cultivated in suitable soil." Love that. Miss Marple first appeared in a 1927 short story, The Tuesday Night Club, that was in a collection called The 13 Problems. Agatha Christie actually never expected Miss Marple to rival Poirot in the public's affections. But since The Murder at the Vicarage, which is Miss Marple's first full-length novel, readers were just hooked. They instantly loved her. She features in 12 novels and 20 short stories. Miss Marple is never paid for her work, and she is not always thanked for it either. The Miss Marple of the original 13 Problems collection is a lot more shrewish and Victorian than the later character, who's a lot more forgiving. So maybe this is an example of not only Agatha Christie changing with the times, but Jane Marple changing with the times. It actually, one of the sources that I found mentions how her attire changes throughout her books, which again is a good indicator of how her character is changing. So I think it's pretty intriguing, actually. Miss Marple never married, and her closest living relatives are her nieces and nephews. Her nephew, Raymond West, is a well known author, and his wife, Joan, who was originally named Joyce, they are most common in the Miss Marple stories. Miss Marple employs a selection of maids. All of them are young women from a nearby orphanage, and Miss Marple trains them in her Victorian way. Some facts about Miss Marple. Her character is partly based on Agatha Christie's grandmother and her grandmother's friends. If you just stop and think about that, it makes all the sense in the world. Think about your grandma and her friends. Yeah, it about checks out. I think it's beautiful. Again, she first appeared in 6 short stories from 1927 to 1928. Her first novel was The Murder at the Vicarage. This was published in 1930. Jane Marple is described as an attractive, thin old lady with a twinkle in her blue eyes. She's a spinster, but she does hint at a beau from her past. Ooh la la. I want to know more about that. She has no background in criminology or in police work. Her hobbies are gardening, knitting, and gossip. We love that for her. St. Mary Mead, her hometown, is a small English village with a local pub, a few shops, the vicarage, and the Gossington Hall estate. However, Jane Marple has a unique understanding of human nature and wickedness, and this comes from her very careful observance of village life and kind of being a busybody, which, again, we love for her. She's very, very house proud. She trains her maids in housekeeping very meticulously. She's also a very, very caring employer with a passion for justice. There is a one of the Wow, I'm sorry, I hit my microphone. One of the Miss Marple books is actually it's called A Pocket Full of Rye, and in this book, one of her maids is murdered, and she seeks revenge for it. She's very, very caring. She's also a very independent spirit. She travels to visit friends in the UK and further abroad. Although most of the Miss Marple stories are set in the English village or countryside, there are a few exceptions. One of the things I love most about Miss Marple, and actually probably one of the things that makes her such a good detective, is that she has learned to expect the worst from everything and everyone. We admire that wholeheartedly. Her nephew, Raymond West, is very fond of his aunt, but like everybody else, he tends to underestimate her. Jane Marple doesn't like to sit still. She enjoys being busy. Sometimes she's limited by her old age, but she enlists the help of others to solve crimes, utilizing knowledge from a network of friends and relatives, servants, police officers, and locals. She's a woman who knows how to use her resources, and that's admirable. We only read from her point of view one time in a short story named Miss Marple Tells a Story. You know exactly what you're getting. In 1942, the Miss Marple novel The Body in the Library, Agatha Christie mentions herself by name. Completely iconic. I love it that she does this in a Miss Marple story. This feels like women empowering women. I can't exactly explain why, but I'm here for it. Here are some quotes about by Miss Marple. In The Sleeping Murder, quote, Miss Marple was an attractive old lady, tall and thin, with pink cheeks and blue eyes and a gentle, rather fussy nature. In the book 450 from Paddington, everybody in St. Mary Mead knew Miss Marple. Fluffy and dithery in appearance, but inwardly as sharp and shrewd as they make them. In They Do It With Mirrors, the worst is so often true. Love that. In At Bertram's Hotel, if people do not choose to lower their voices, one must assume that they are prepared to be overheard. Again, love it. In the story, a murder is announced. Quote, really, I have no gifts at all, except perhaps a certain knowledge of human nature. I think her gift is just existing. Miss Marple is incredible. In the novel, A Caribbean Mystery, quote, sex as a word had not been mentioned in Miss Marple's young days, but there had been plenty of it, not talked about so much, but enjoyed far more than nowadays, or so it seemed to her. Though usually labeled sin, capital S, she couldn't help feeling that this was preferable to what it seemed nowadays, a kind of duty. I have not read A Caribbean Mystery, but I want to, based solely on this quote, because I need more context. And finally, in the novel A Pocket Full of Rye, where her maid is murdered, she says, this is a wicked murderer, Inspector Neil, and the wicked should not go unpunished. So yes, we are here for Miss Marple in every way. So again, the reason that we took this little jaunt off on this little side road is because these two characters are very, very important to Agatha Christie and to her career. So I'm glad that we got the chance to talk about them a little bit and their impact on the world. But now we're going to return to the life of Agatha Christie herself. In 1922, she left her daughter Rosalind with a nurse and her mother Clara, and she and Archie traveled across the British Empire to promote the Empire Exhibition of 1924. They did this as part of Archie's work. So this grand tour, it was 10 months long. They went to South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, and Canada. They extended their time in Hawaii by 3 months so that they could surf, which is incredible. And while they were in Cape Town, Agatha Christie became the first British woman ever to surf standing up. We are breaking records everywhere, my friends. And of course, she kept writing. While they were in Cape Town, not only was she just surfing, but she also heard the really good news that there were a bunch of wonderful reviews for her novel, The Secret Adversary. Now, The Secret Adversary was her second novel, and this novel introduced the detective couple Tommy and Tuppence. She earned £50 for this book, so about $2,000, which we're loving. And I just really love the thought of her being on this tour and finding out that her second novel is not only selling well, but that reviewers like it. I really, really just love this for her. And I think that in many ways, I think that this is really the first time that Agatha Christie is realizing what she's capable of as far as her writing goes. So they're on this tour, remember, and Archie's boss, who they were with all throughout this tour, he was actually the inspiration for the character Sir Eustace Pedlar in The Man in the Brown Suit, which is set in Africa. Now, fun fact, the man in the brown suit was eventually serialized, and with that money, she bought a Morris Cowley car that was gray, and she absolutely loved this car. She actually later said that it was one of the biggest excitements of her life that she got to buy this car. So, claps for her. By now, Agatha is a pretty established writer. After her third novel and a few short stories that were commissioned by the Sketch magazine, she didn't have any more trouble selling her work. But at this point, she also realized that she wanted to switch publishers, which I say, go for it, girl. You take control of your career. She was done dealing with the unfair terms that she had with the Bodley Head. She was just done. So she sought out an agent by the name of Edmund Cork at Hughes Massey, the Hughes Massey firm. Fun fact, Hughes Massey, this man that owned the firm, he was actually the agent of Eden Philpotts. Remember him? The family friend who gave Agatha writing advice? Interesting connection. So her new agent, Edmund Cork, he found her a new publisher by the name of William Collins and Sons. You know this publisher, my friends, because it's Harper Collins. Yeah, HarperCollins Publishing was originally William Collins and Sons, and Agatha Christie became one of their authors, which is amazing. So after the world tour ends, they get back to London. Archie and Agatha settle into a new house in the London suburbs, and they name this house Styles after her first novel. And this is when things they begin to take a turn for the worse, and a really difficult time in Agatha's life begins. Her mother, Clara, passed away in April of 1926. And if you'll remember, she was incredibly close to her mother. And Agatha was often left alone to clean out Ashfield. She was struggling a lot to write her next novel for HarperCollins. It was called The Mystery of the Blue Train. And she was able to finish the book much later, but she also said that it was easily the worst book she ever wrote. And if you think about all of this, all that she's going through, her mother just died, having to clean out her childhood home, go through all of the, they're going through their life, essentially. She's doing all of this alone. And then she's trying to deal with the pressure of writing another novel. That's just a no. That's a big no. And on top of all of this, there's more. Archie and Agatha's relationship had become strained because she was depressed. Listen to me, my friends, and listen well. Agatha was going through an incredibly difficult time in her life and was very depressed. And her husband, the man who had promised to be by her side in sickness and in health, fell in love with somebody else. Yes, you heard me correctly. Her name was Nancy Neal. She was a family friend and a very keen golfer. Now listen, Archie loved golfing, and Agatha was not a golfer. Clearly, his life was beyond not to be tolerated. His wife was sad because she had lost her dear mother and was often alone in her family home going through things, and she didn't golf. How was he supposed to cope? Well, he didn't. He had an affair. That's what happened. Um, okay. And actually, this is obviously incredibly sad. And Agatha completely broke down. Listen, I'm not being completely objective here, as you can see. I really don't know that much about Archie. I don't know what the family did or does think of him, but from just what I do know of him and the tiny bit that we'll continue to mention, I'm just I'm just going to be more bold and say how I feel. Archibald Christie is a huge dick. Yes, I said what I said. Agatha Christie lost her mother. She's cleaning out her childhood home and suffering from depression and experiencing major pressure in her career, and he has an affair. Not cool, man. Not cool. So, like I mentioned, Agatha completely broke down when she heard about her husband's affair. As you can probably imagine, because she's already going through a lot and then her husband decides to be a dick. So, what happened? I'm going to tell you. In early December of 1926, Agatha's staying at Ashfield and something happens. She's very, very overwhelmed, to say the least. Now, she had a very, very close friend who was also her secretary named Carlo, who was often with her. Carlo was away for the night, and Agatha was feeling overwhelmed by literally everything. So she left Rosalind and the house in the care of the maids, and she didn't tell anybody where she was going. She just went out. The next morning, her beloved car was found abandoned several miles away. And thus, from here, as you can probably imagine, it was chaos, and a nationwide search began. Listen, this was a huge deal in the press, literally everywhere. This stuff went international, my dudes. Her disappearance made the cover of the New York Times in 1926. Okay? Like, this stuff, word traveled. It was a really, really big deal. Everyone knew, and everyone was totally there for the salacious gossip. Like, OMG, the crime writer disappeared. And it was absolutely sensational. Like, it's incredible. But there were many people who were actually genuinely scared and worried for her. Weird. Arthur Conan Doyle, heard of him? We love him. He actually tried to help find her during her disappearance. He gave one of her gloves to a medium in hopes of finding her. This didn't work, but I love it that Arthur Conan Doyle was like, hey, we need to help find Agatha Christie. I love that. So, what happened? I'm over here ranting about how Agatha Christie disappeared and it was all over the world, which it was. But what happened? I'll tell you. Somehow, she made her way to King's Cross Station, where she then took a train to Harrogate. She checked into the Harrogate Spa Hotel under the name Teresa Neal, previously of South Africa. She was thereafter recognized by hotel staff who called the police. Listen, Agatha at this time was possibly concussed and definitely had amnesia. Archie came to get her from the hotel and she didn't recognize him, and she had no idea who she was at this point. Listen, this is a sensational, out of this world crazy story. But listen, this is literally all the information that we have. Agatha Christie was an intensely private person, and she was made even more so by the media circus that this had caused. She never spoke of this time with friends or family, and in her autobiography, there is no mention of or reference to her disappearance. None. Some people, including her biographer, claim that she was in a sort of disassociative state, that it was a nervous breakdown, maybe a way obviously a way for her to deal with the trauma, but maybe she was aware of her actions, but she was unable to control her emotions as part of the psychosis of the moment. And again, the public saw this very, very negatively. They thought that maybe she was doing it to embarrass her husband, to frame him for her murder, that it was a publicity stunt. Don't even get me started on this because it makes me absolutely livid. This woman was going through horrific things in her life, and something happened in her brain, and it was just self preservation. But yes, let's victim blame and talk about how embarrassing it must be for her cheating husband. Let's talk about that. Oh my goodness, his life is so freaking hard. Give me a second and I'll be okay. Okay. Agatha Christie, after this, she recuperated at her sister's house called Abney Hall, where she was sequestered, quote, in a guarded hall, gates locked, telephone off, and callers turned away. Yeah, give the woman some privacy and time to heal. Thank you. She remained apart from Archie, obviously, and she followed a course of psychiatric treatment in London. Now, at this time, she needed income, but she was unable to write new material. It was just not happening, which, yeah, that's probably fine. Her brother in law, Campbell Christie, can we talk about this? How her brother in law stepped in to help her? Her brother in law stepped in to help her? I'm going to say it again. Her brother in law stepped in to help her because her husband was probably off with his mistress. I'm just going to continue now. Her brother-in-law suggested that she should combine some of the Poirot short stories that had been composed for the Sketch magazine and kind of just combine them into a new work, which was a fabulous idea. So she took a bunch of these stories and they were reworked and combined into a novel called The Big Four, which is just beautiful. Eventually, Agatha did come to terms with the fact that her marriage to Archie was over, and the divorce was finalized in 1928. Archie married his mistress, Nancy Neal, a week after the divorce was final. So yeah, I'm going to stick to how I feel about him. Agatha got custody of Rosalind, and she ended up keeping the last name Christie because that's how people knew her. In her autobiography, she wrote, quote, "So after illness came sorrow, despair, and heartbreak. There is no need to dwell on it," which is very sad. After this, Agatha and Rosalind traveled to the Canary Islands to complete her convalescence. She's basically still recovering from having a nervous breakdown. They stayed for 3 months, and while they were there, Agatha finished the book, The Mystery of the Blue Train. Again, this is the book that she struggled to write while mourning for her mother, the book that she later said was the worst one she ever wrote. I don't know about that, but that's what she said. In late 1928, she wrote a novel called Giant's Bread. Now listen, this is important. This was the very first book that Agatha Christie ever wrote under a pen name, the name Mary Westmacott. Under this name, she wrote several more novels. Giant's Bread was not a detective novel. It was actually a work of fiction about a composer who's forced to work for financial reasons. This is important for so many reasons. This pen name, Mary Westmacott, or even basically this alter ego, is really important to the Agatha Christie story and to the lady herself. So we're going to spend a teeny bit of time talking about her life and career as Mary Westmacott. From the beginning, the Mary Westmacott novels, like on the book jackets and things like that, it was put forward that Mary Westmacott was not the real name of the actual author. It was said on the books, this is a well-known author, and she's sold a lot of books, basically. It was disguised through understatement, essentially. Agatha Christie ended up writing, again, 6 novels as Mary Westmacott, and she always said that the pen name gave her freedom to explore, quote, her most private and precious imaginative garden, which is so beautiful. And you can see how, as Agatha Christie had become really prolific and really famous as a crime writer so quickly, you can see how having a pen name would just give her the freedom to explore other areas of creativity. It's very understandable. Some actually refer to the Mary Westmacott novels as semi autobiographical. I can neither confirm nor deny that. And here's the sad thing: the secrecy of Mary Westmacott actually ended in 1946. Nearly 20 years of secrecy was blown by an American reviewer who was reviewing her book, Absent in the Spring. Now, this book, she actually wrote it in one weekend, which is a level of cool we'll never get to. Agatha was, of course, very disappointed that her cover was blown because she had enjoyed writing as Mary Westmacott without the pressure of being Agatha Christie, but she did not give up. She did write two more Mary Westmacott novels even after her cover was blown, which I love. And I feel like her time as Mary Westmacott is a moment, it's an example of Agatha Christie kind of taking herself and her life back after her divorce and the tragedies and upsets that she had suffered. It's this moment of her creating her own narrative and rebirthing herself. And I love it. I love it. And an interesting fact is that her novels written as Mary Westmacott generally got much better reviews and reception from critics than her crime fiction did, which is absolutely insane because, as we know, her crime fiction is still wildly popular. It just flew off of the shelves. But critically, her Mary Westmacott novels often did better, which is very interesting and probably worth talking about, but that's a story for another time. The next part of Agatha Christie's story is both beautiful and refreshing. It's literally a breath of fresh air. I cannot emphasize this enough. So, Agatha Christie had always wanted to travel on the Orient Express, understandably. She decided in the autumn of 1928 to make her dreams come true, and she went on a trip. That was Duncan whining. We can't go on the Orient Express. I understand. It's a sad day. So, a chance dinner party conversation persuaded Agatha to travel to Baghdad and then to the archaeological site at Ur, that's how you pronounce that, where she became really good friends with the Woolies who ran the dig. They eventually invited her to come back the next year to the dig. And it was this year, the second time round, that she met 25-year-old archaeologist in training, Max Mallowan, who would become her second husband. He was 13 years younger than her, and they met when Catherine Woolley asked Max to show Agatha the sights. It's so beautiful. They found each other's company relaxing. They were very, very comfortable with one another. Their relationship was forged by travel. They could both rough it, essentially. I love their relationship for so many reasons, but when you start reading about it, when you get to know a little bit more about it, really it's the kind of relationship where when they were together, it just felt good. It was just this comfortable, peaceful feeling. And after everything she had experienced, that kind of love is exactly what she needed. And I'm so glad that she got it. And it's just beautiful. Max proposed to her. He was visiting Ashfield, and he proposed to her on his last evening there. They were married on September 11th, 1930. She was 40 years old. They married at St. Cuthbert's Church in Edinburgh, and Agatha slightly reduced her age on her new passport that she had acquired for the honeymoon, which, like, you go, girl. After the honeymoon, Max went to a dig alone for the last time, and Agatha returned to London to write. They just needed to get some things in order, really. After this, they established a pattern for their life, a very productive and recurring writing and traveling routine. They would spend their summers at Ashfield with Rosalind. They would spend Christmas with her sister's family at Abney Hall. Late autumn and spring were spent on archaeological digs, and they spent the rest of the year in London or at their country house in Winterbrook. And it's just, I think of this phase in her life as kind of like the linen phase, because she's going on archaeological digs with her husband many times a year. And it's just whimsical and linen and beautiful. And I love it that they get to spend their summers with Rosalind at Agatha's childhood home. And they spend Christmas time with her sister at her sister's house, Abney Hall. Now, this is really important because Agatha really, really loved her sister, and she very much loved her sister's house. She spent as much time there as she could. It was Abney Hall was kind of your traditional English manor home, but it was very, very beautiful, and Agatha Christie got a lot of inspiration from Abney Hall, and it's very sweet. I found a quote, and it says, "Abney became Agatha's greatest inspiration for country house life, with all its servants and grandeur being woven into her plots. The descriptions of the fictional chimneys, stony gates, and other houses in her stories are mostly Abney Hall in various forms," which I just love. I love it that she had all of these peaceful, wonderful, inspirational places to go to, and we will actually get more into that later in the episode. So she and Max are happily married, and they're living this wonderful life of traveling and working on their passions and spending time with their family and friends. It's a level of happiness and contentment and peace that she absolutely deserves after all the tragedy that she's endured. And we need to talk about the archaeology here, because as we can see, Agatha had become very interested in and passionate about archaeology. I mean, that's how she met her husband. She was going on digs with Max, which is so romantic. I love it. I love it that they could do things they were passionate about together. I just love the idea of them out doing digs together. It's just beautiful. On on digs, she would write a chapter or two of books in the quiet morning, and then in the afternoon she would help Max out on the sites. She would even help by cleaning some of the finds with her face cream, which is sweet and kind and helpful, but definitely not up to code. Just gonna say that. Um, Agatha Christie also studied photography at Reinhardt School, and she took photos of the artifacts that Max found. These were very, very beautiful artistic photos. Now, Max was very supportive of Agatha and loved her very much. But this is an interesting little tidbit. He wasn't a fan of the photography that she did of his artifacts, and it was because it was too beautiful. He wanted the artifacts, if pictures were going to be taken of them, he wanted them done practically, artifacts in kind of their natural habitat or how they would have been used. And Agatha was such a good photographer and so artistic that the pictures ended up very beautiful, and he was like, no, that's not what we want with these kind of photos. So it's really, really interesting, and it just speaks to her artistic abilities, and it's beautiful. And as you can imagine, being on digs so often, the atmosphere of the Middle East was really, really inspiring to Agatha. The more that you learn about her and the more you learn about her works, you see how she was so good at using her life experiences to inspire her work. So, this Middle East emphasis, influence, that's the word I'm looking for. We have Murder on the Orient Express, Murder in Mesopotamia, Appointment with Death, They Came to Baghdad, and many, many other short stories that were written during this period. In fact, room 411 at the Para Palace Hotel in Istanbul is dedicated to Agatha Christie. It is said that she wrote part of Murder on the Orient Express while staying in that room, and the room has many pictures of her and many copies of her books. Now, as you can probably tell from earlier in the episode, there is something about the feeling of these ritzy or educated people at this time being in Egypt and the Middle East that kind of makes me go a little feral. And I can't really explain why, but nevertheless, it exists. So I just love the fact that she has so many novels and short stories centered around this time in her life because it's a very important time in her life. And yes, she's writing fictional works, but I also think it's a way to record the experiences that she's having. And I love that she got to have this life and live this life. Agatha Christie is a really inspiring example of writing from experience and writing about the life that you live and writing for people like yourself. And yes, we are going to talk more about this later, don't you even worry. Along with all of these happy things that are going on at the time, there are also some tragedies that are occurring simultaneously, which is kind of the way that life is. And in studying Agatha Christie, I think it's also just really the way that her life was, to be honest. For example, she was forced to sell Ashfield, her childhood home, in the 1930s. And after all of this time where she and her mother experienced financial difficulties and all of these things. There were so many times throughout her life where she almost lost Ashfield and she was able to keep it. But then eventually she had to sell it. And I can imagine how devastating that must have been for her. And I tried to look more into this um, about why she had to sell Ashfield or what was happening, but I couldn't find any more information on that. Again, Agatha Christie was a very private person, so perhaps nobody really knows. But again, she did have to sell Ashfield in the 1930s. However, Agatha portrays this time in her life overall as very happy. Agatha, Max, and Rosalind passed the majority of the 1930s doing their linen phase. Like I said, they're traveling, they're working, just generally being super cool, doing archaeology and writing and stuff. In 1934, they purchased a home called Winterbrook House that was near Wallingford. This was their main residence for the rest of their lives, and this is where Agatha did most of her writing. 4 years later, in 1938, they bought Greenway Estate on River Dart, and this was their holiday home. Agatha referred to Greenway Estate as, quote, the loveliest place in the world. She never, as far as we know, she never wrote while she was at Greenway, but she got a lot of inspiration from the house and from the grounds, which is really interesting. And just a little fact, the Greenway Estate was given to the National Trust in the year 2000. But if you'll recall, the 1930s were leading the world places. And those places all ended up at one thing: World War II. Now remember, Agatha has already experienced a world war. She's sitting here like, I did this already. How do you suppose World War II impacted Agatha? Well, I'm going to tell you. Max actually got a wartime job in Cairo. He spoke many different languages, so this ability with languages um, is what made him eligible for this assignment. He helped in the War Office in Cairo with translations and a whole bunch of other stuff that he probably wasn't allowed to talk about, which is pretty neat. Agatha stayed in England. She was writing and she was volunteering at the dispensary at University College Hospital in London. So again, we see this is an example of Agatha using her pharmaceutical knowledge and making sure her training is up to speed with the times and using it to, in this case, help her country, which is really incredible. At this time, she wrote a novel called N or M, and it's a wartime novel. It's been called Agatha's patriotic gesture to the war effort. And she was actually really disconcerted when the publication of this work was delayed in the United States until after the US joined the war. Don't get me started on how late the United States joined the war. That's a story for another time. However, there is a fantastic story about this book, and I'm going to tell you. This story, N or M, it contains a character by the name of Major Bletchley, okay, who has always been considered one of Agatha's less appealing characters. Get this, my friends. Listen to this. The agency MI5 ended up investigating Agatha Christie because they thought that maybe she was a spy in their top secret code breaking center, Bletchley Park. This is wild? Investigators, however, realized she wasn't a threat when she told people, I was stuck there on my way by train from Oxford to London and took revenge by giving the name to one of my least lovable characters. You guys, this is the most hilarious, the I'm stuttering because it's insane. The amount of small things that had to combine together to make this event even possible is insane. It's World War II. It's England. It's Agatha Christie gets stuck at a train station and she's upset. So she names her character after this area she's in. And then all of a sudden, the government thinks that she's a spy and they start investigating her. It's absolutely crazy. And it's phenomenal. Like, I want a story like that in my autobiography someday. That would be lovely. I don't know. I just love that story. Um, Moving on. I could talk a lot about this story, about Agatha being a not spy, but we'll move on. So at this time, her daughter Rosalind had married a man named Hubert Pritchard, and she gave birth to her son Matthew on September 21st, 1943. Again, Max is still in Cairo working for the War Office, but Agatha was a very doting grandmother, and she often looked after her grandson, which is sweet. Interestingly enough, the basement of her house at Sheffield Terrace in London was bombed out during World War II. You guys, I don't know how much you know about London during World War II. Saying that makes it sound like I know a lot about London during World War II. False. But what I do know is that it was bombed heavily. Okay, the fact that anything from the past of London remains is actually astonishing because it was bombed very, very heavily during the war. So it's honestly not surprising that Agatha ran into this in her life. But again, the basement of her house was bombed out. And then at this time, she moved to Lawn Road Flats, which was a very modernist building, and she really liked it there. But again, her life at this time consists of writing, volunteering at the hospital, and spending time with her daughter and her grandson. She was actually very focused and prolific at this time. She missed Max, and entertainment was severely limited because of the war. So, this is when Agatha Christie wrote her classics. This is when she wrote And Then There Were None, Evil Under the Sun, The Body in the Library, Five Little Pigs, and The Moving Finger. I love it that she took this thing that was super really not fun and was like, hey, I'm about to write some classics, stand aside. That's probably what she said. Max returned to London in 1945 at the end of the war. Now, listen to this, my friends. At this time, the end of the war, Agatha decided to become less prolific. She basically said, hey, I've been writing a lot of books. I'm going to chill. And do you want to know why she decided to do that? It was for tax reasons. My friends, she decided to not write as much for tax reasons. And there is so much to unpack there that I'm not even going to approach it, but I love it and it's crazy. Anyway, so at this time, Agatha Christie is in her mid 50s, and again, I haven't said this before. At this time, I think she's ready for a little bit of a slower pace in her life. So this probably had something to do with her becoming less prolific along with the tax issue. The end of the 1940s was really tough for everybody. I mean, you had rationing and stuff was still going on after the war. Everybody is trying to rebuild. Um, Again, there's a lot of shortages. And listen, food rationing didn't end in England until 1954, which I did not know and is actually totally wild. 10 years after the war ended, they're finally finishing food rationing. I think that gives you a pretty good indication of just how much of an impact there was and how far reaching it was in even in just practical terms. The theater, the theater. What happened to the theater? I am here for Danny Kaye references always. And this one is particularly fitting for this next chapter of Agatha Christie's life because it is all about the theater. Now, you may know Agatha Christie as an incredible novelist, but did you know that she was actually a very, very successful playwright? Well, it's true. Let's talk about it. Agatha Christie, if you'll remember, loved the theater from the time that she was really little. And for many years, she was actually the president of her local amateur drama society in Wallingford, which we love. The 1940s and 50s was when she started to spend a lot of time focusing on the theater, and this limited her time to write her usual novels. But holy moly, my friends, this woman was so amazing. We're going to dive into her theater life a little bit because it's crazy. So, first and foremost, Agatha Christie is the only crime novelist ever to achieve equal and international fame as a dramatist. She is the only female dramatist to ever have 3 plays running simultaneously in London's West End. Let me repeat that. 3 plays running simultaneously in London's West End. Thank you. Just when you think Agatha Christie can't get any cooler, when she can't do anything more amazing, you are proven wrong. I literally cannot handle how amazing, just how cool Agatha Christie is. She's amazing, she's wonderful, she's terrific, all these things, but she's so cool. And I uh, we should all aspire to be this cool. I'm telling you. She wrote over 30 plays, people. Her play, The Mousetrap, is the longest running play in the world. It debuted in 1952 and it is still running strong. That's correct, you heard me. Her favorite play that she ever wrote was Witness for the Prosecution. Now, listen, this story's wild. Agatha Christie kept such a low profile that at the premiere party for this play, Witness for the Prosecution, she got to the door and she wasn't recognized. And so she was turned away. The bouncer was like, "LOL, no, get out of here, lady." She was too shy to identify herself as the author of the play and demand that she be let in, so she just left. Isn't that crazy? It's wow, it's crazy. But she did end up winning an Edgar Award for Best Play for Witness for the Prosecution, which is very lovely. On the day that Agatha Christie passed away, the West End theaters dimmed their lights for 1 hour, as is only good and proper, in my opinion. So, even though Agatha spent the 40s and 50s mostly involved in theater ventures, there were also a bunch of other really important things that happened to her in the 1950s specifically, which we absolutely need to take a moment to talk about. She actually started writing her autobiography in 1950, and it took 15 years to finish it. It was finished in 1965. Also in 1950, she became a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. In 1954, she was the recipient of the first ever Grand Master Award from the Mystery Writers of America. And in 1955, Agatha Christie became a limited company. Basically, she was tired of dealing with the tax situations that were created by holding all of the rights to her works and everything like that. So she created the company in order to make everything easier in that way. To this day, her family is still a part of the company and very engaged in Agatha's legacy, in all of the reprints, in all of the adaptations, and the family slash company also approved the author Sophie Hannah as the continuation writer of the Hercule Poirot stories. So we love that. And in 1958, Agatha Christie accepted the presidency of the famous Detection Club. Now listen, she only accepted this presidency on the very strict understanding that she would never have to make a speech. She is committed to her aesthetic, and I appreciate and applaud all of that. So we are now approaching the latter end of Agatha Christie's life. But please do not let that fool you into thinking that she just completely calmed down and there isn't a ton to talk about. That's exactly the opposite of the truth, actually. In 1961, she was conferred with an honorary doctorate degree in literature from Exeter University, which she very much deserved. Max was knighted for archaeology in 1968, so she could now be styled as Lady Malowan, and Agatha was knighted in 1971. They are one of the only couples in history to both have been knighted for their own work, which is very impressive. In 1972, she was immortalized at Madame Tussauds, and Agatha actually considered retiring at the age of 75. Now, listen, her books were selling so well at this point that she just kept writing, and she kept writing until she was 85, which was only a year before she died. She just won't let anything stop her. It's incredible. And her last novel was in 1973, and it was called Postern of Fate. Her last public appearance was at the 1974 film premiere of Murder on the Orient Express, where Albert Finney played Hercule Poirot. Her verdict was that it was a good adaptation, but his mustache was not luxurious enough, which is lovely. In her autobiography, she wrote, quote, "What can I say at the age of 75? Thank God for my good life and for all the love that has been given to me." So she very much considered herself to have had a really happy life. She had an amazingly successful career. And Agatha Christie passed away on January 12th, 1976. She is buried in the churchyard of St. Mary's, Chelsea, near Wallingford. Her obituary in the Times, which is the British daily national newspaper based in London, said, quote, "She never cared much for the cinema or for wireless and television. Dame Agatha's private pleasures were gardening. She won local prizes for horticulture and buying furniture for her various houses. She was a shy person. She disliked public appearances, but she was friendly and sharp-witted to meet. By inclination as well as breeding, she belonged to the English upper middle class. She wrote about and for people like herself. That was an essential part of her charm." Agatha Christie's career lasted 5 decades. She wrote 66 crime novels. She wrote 6 non crime novels. She wrote 150 short stories and over 30 plays. Agatha Christie has been dubbed the Duchess of Death, the Mistress of Mystery, and the Queen of Crime. Also, her works have been translated into over 100 languages, which makes her the most translated author of all time. And during her lifetime, she sold about 300 million books. These facts just blow me away. I keep reading more, and I keep being more astonished. One of her most famous quotes is, quote, "The artist is only the glass through which we see nature, and the clearer and more absolutely pure that glass, so much the more perfect picture we can see through it. Never intrude yourself." At the BoucherCon World Mystery Convention in May of 2000, Agatha Christie received the Mystery Writer of the Century Award, and the Hercule Poirot Mystery Series received the Mystery Series of the Century Award as well, which I think all of them deserve and more. So we're now approaching the end of our episode, but there actually are more things that we need to talk about when it comes to Agatha Christie. Because can you see what I mean about her life being so fascinating? We've gone through the timeline of her life. I've shared with you so many different things about her. But there's so much that I wanted to share that I wasn't able to include in the flow of the narrative. So we're going to take a minute here to just address some of these things, some of these really important things. Now, several times throughout this episode, we have seen that Agatha Christie was, to say the very least, a prolific writer. She turned out works so quickly, and all of them were of superior quality. But what was life like for her when it came to her actual writing? Like, what was her writing process? I actually have some of those answers. Now, listen. As a rule, Agatha Christie wrote 2 or 3 books every single year. In my notes, I have the words, shoot me. 2 or 3 books a year? I'm beside myself. It's crazy. In her early career, she wrote in longhand and then somebody else would type up the manuscript. When the dictaphone was invented, she would dictate stories into it and then a secretary would make it into a typescript, after which Agatha would make the corrections by hand. It would take her a few months to write one book and then about 1 month to revise it before it was sent off to be published. She would read chapters of her books to her family and friends after dinner, and they would all try to guess who the murderer was. And this was often at their holiday home at Greenway. And her grandson said, quote, "A few months later, we would see those stories in the bookshops," which is just the quaintest, coziest thing I've ever heard in my life. Another thing that we have seen throughout this episode is that Agatha Christie just had this incredible ability to break records and truly, truly make a difference in the world with her work and to impact people with her work. And it's so admirable. And I actually just have a quick list of fun and mind blowingly cool facts that speak to this sort of thing. In 1977, an actual poisoning case was solved because British medical personnel had read one of her books and recognized the symptoms. A pile of all of the US editions of the book Peril at End House would stretch to the moon. Just the US editions, remember. A 1-volume edition of the complete Miss Marple stories holds the world record for thickest book at 4,032 pages. When Penguin paperbacks launched in 1935, The Mysterious Affair at Styles was one of the first 10 titles it published. The Murder at the Vicarage is one of the first titles in HarperCollins' famous Crime Club series. The work 3-Act Tragedy, published in 1935, was Agatha's first book to sell 10,000 copies in its first year. That's correct, it's insane. And this next fact, I have read this a million times. The information has sunk in, but it will never stop being the most astonishing thing that I've ever heard in my life. Agatha Christie is the first crime writer to have 100,000 copies of 10 of her titles published by Penguin on the same day in 1948, known as a Penguin Million. In one day, 1,000,000 copies of her books were published. That is astonishing. That, my friends, is a writer. She's amazing. And apart from the crazy awesome way that she was just able to create and write so much, there are a few other just wonderful facts about Agatha that I really want to share because they're wonderful. Her favorite color was green, the only suitable choice. Her favorite writers were Elizabeth Bowen and Graham Greene. She never smoked or drank alcohol because she hated the smells and tastes, which is interesting. She was a lifelong member of the Church of England and was described as, quote, quietly devout. She kept her mother's copy of The Imitation of Christ on her bedside table always and attended church regularly. According to her, her dislikes included, quote, crowds being jammed up against people, loud voices, noise, protracted talking, parties, and especially cocktail parties, cigarette smoke and smoking generally, any kind of drink except in cooking, marmalade oysters, not marmalade oysters, that's not a thing, marmalade, oysters, lukewarm food, gray skies, the feet of birds, or indeed the feel of a bird altogether. That cracks me up. You can talk to my friend Quinn about how she feels about pigeons. It's interesting. Final and fiercest dislike, the taste and smell of hot milk. I do not blame you, Dame Agatha Christie. According to her, her likes were, quote, sunshine, apples, almost any kind of music, railway trains, numerical puzzles, or anything to do with numbers, going to the sea, bathing and swimming, silence, sleeping, dreaming, eating, the smell of coffee, lilies of the valley, most dogs, and going to the theater. It's all just the most wholesome thing I've ever heard. The two things that she was most excited about in her life were her car, we talked about this, the gray bottle-nosed Morris Cowley, and the fact that she was invited to dine with the Queen at Buckingham Palace. Another thing I love so much about Agatha Christie is that she loved houses and she loved making a home. She later said that this developed from a childhood joy of playing with her dolls' houses, and she said, quote, "I can see quite plainly now that I have continued to play house ever since. I have gone over innumerable houses, bought houses, exchanged them for other houses, furnished houses, decorated houses, made structural alterations to houses. Houses. God bless houses." I love this fact about her. I love it so much. I could probably talk about that for another hour and a half. I'm not going to, but I probably could. I love how much home meant to her and how much creating a home and a peaceful environment meant to her. I think that it speaks so much to who she was as a person that home and creating a home meant this much to her. And that's why I decided to add it because, again, I just think it's really important. Now, I really hope that you have all had as much fun with this episode as I have. Like I said at the beginning, I've always known who Agatha Christie was, and she's had a pretty healthy presence in my life. But I just had no idea that getting to know her would be so enlightening and fascinating, and honestly, just really inspiring and cool. Her life was so incredible. There's so much I had to leave out. It was so fascinating, all of the things that she did, all the things she was able to do. I truly hope that you have found some kind of joy or inspiration or even just learned something fun and new for yourself about this woman, because this episode was so much fun to research for and to write. It was very, very wonderful to be able to just learn more about her and see how she approached life and all the things that she was able to do despite the tragedies that she faced. As a writer myself, I very much look up to Agatha Christie now that I know all these things about her. I find her really inspiring in pretty much every way. And I don't know if there's anything more that I could say about her. I'm just really happy that we got to do this episode. And if you haven't, or even if you have, go read some Agatha Christie. You will not regret it, my friends, not at all. Thank you so much for being here with me today, for hanging out with me, for being here with me through this long episode that was so much fun. Thank you. You can follow me on Instagram or send me a DM at notstrictlyhistory_podcast, or you can send me an email at notstrictlyhistory@gmail.com. Again, thank you so much for being here, and we'll see you next time on Not Strictly History.